What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the Season 4 premiere of Invincible. They dropped the first 3 episodes today, and the next 5 will come out on a weekly basis. And from what we've seen so far, it looks like this season's going to more or less tackle Robert Kirkman's original story arc from issues 66 to 78 in very satisfying fashion. I liked the first episode and the third episode, but episode 2 was even better. And fingers crossed, hopefully we'll get some episodes later in the season written by Robert Kirkman himself, as we've seen in previous seasons. Because when you look back on Season 3 and think about which episodes were the strongest, for me, there were episodes 7 and 8, and coincidentally, those 2 episodes were written by Robert Kirkman. At any rate, I'll go spoiler-free at first, and then I'll give you both a verbal warning as well as a time code below before discussing anything specific from either the show or the comics, because while the show doesn't do like a rigid page-by-page adaptation, that said, the show overall does go out of its way to tackle some of the best pages or the best splash pages or the best moments or best scenes from Robert Kirkman's original comics, arguably more so than just about any other comic book adaptation that I've ever seen, at least since the days of 300 and Watchmen by Zack Snyder back in the day. And I have to admit, there's part of me that gets a huge, massive, geeky thrill out of seeing somebody try to adapt specific comic book stories as opposed to just treating the character like any old IP that can be plugged into any old story. There's a massive problem these days where a lot of superhero shows and movies are being written and directed by people who grew up on shows and movies and not the comics that inspired those original shows and movies, and have absolutely no appreciation or understanding or knowledge of any of the key storylines in that character's history. But in that this show's creator, Robert Kirkman, happens to be a big, giant comic book nerd and also happens to be the guy who wrote all these comic books back in the day, it makes sense that he wants to try and more or less get the story right. Also, for anyone who's curious as to how far we are through the story, there were originally 144 issues in Robert Kirkman's original comic book series, and as I mentioned before, this season's trying to capture most of the big story beats, most of the big, the key events from issues 66 to 78, and Robert Kirkman's gone on record saying that he needs somewhere between 7 and 9 seasons total to finish the story in animated form. We'll see if Amazon lets him get to the end of the story. But last night I had a little free time on my hands and I decided I wanted to reread the comics being adapted for this season. But to my horror, when I got all these trade paperbacks down from a bookshelf, I realized that this takes us up through issue 65, which is the end of season 3. And I was like, oh no, because I remembered there was a point where I ran out of trade paperbacks and I had to start buying standalone issues, which meant I was going to have to go through my fucking long boxes. And I've got them alphabetized in an order, but going through my long boxes, as you can see in this picture here, it's basically like going to like a CrossFit workout. I mean, it requires a lot of sweating and groaning to find anything in there. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go on the Kindle and I'm just going to buy a few standalone issues, where I realized the point at which I started buying digital comics versus physical comics was in 2011, right around issue 77 of Invincible. So I already had 77 and 78 on my iPad ready to be downloaded. I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna, I'll splurge and I'll buy a few other issues just to flesh out my knowledge. And the good news is, because I bought this digital comics last night, I'll be able to cross-reference the events of the show so far with some of the key splash pages from the comic. So big picture, once again, totally spoiler-free. When it comes to my likes and dislikes of this show so far, at least of what I've seen, I love this show's willingness to just completely, utterly shatter and destroy the status quo on pretty much a regular basis. Like every single season seems to have these massive apocalyptic events, almost to the point where it's like, how does this world even function? Where if like every couple of months there's an alien invasion or Viltrumites showing up or whatever the case might be. But when this show decides to kind of go to the dark side, you're just like, oh my God, I'm not entirely sure that this civilization would even be able to function at all if they had like, superheroes grabbing, Mark by his face and like flying them through the crowd and that sort of thing. But I love the show's willingness to basically say, yeah, we're not going to restore the status quo at the end of every single issue or at the end of every single season or whatever the case might be. This show is building up toward my favorite event from the comics, basically like the Viltrumite War, which should come sometime late in the season. But I feel like all roads have been leading toward this ever since Mark and his father first had their big epic confrontation back in season 1. And I'll say this, every once in a while, the show will take something gory and bloody from the comics and then just like throw gasoline on it and magnify it by 1,000, because some of the big key bloody events from the comics are pretty gruesome on the page, but in the show, it's like, oh my God, like calm down, like, you fucking sadists. Like, what are you doing here? But in all seriousness, I love it when they go to the dark side, because so few shows and so few movies these days are willing to go to the dark side. And at the end of this video, I'll make a few recommendations when it comes to R-rated animation or X-rated animation. Speaking of X-rated, Fritz the Cat, I believe this was the first X-rated animated movie ever made, and it was a monster hit back in the day for director Ralph Bakshi. But I am a fan of animation that is geared toward an adult sensibility. But that sensibility, I would say, it's inconsistent in the show. Like 90% of the time, the show is geared toward an adult sensibility, but it still has this lingering problem of these cheesy TV soap opera beats that just drive me crazy. And they've more or less ironed them out since the early seasons. I feel like the earlier seasons had a much bigger problem with this, where Mark would be with his mother or his girlfriend or his friends or whatever, and they're having those, like, just those predictable TV beats where it's like, Mom, I really got to talk to you about my feelings. She's like, okay, honey, let's have this conversation. And it's so insufferable and so unendurable. And in season 4, we're still seeing scenes involving Mark's mother where I'm like, either find a way to make it relevant to the central storyline or just stop giving her scenes. Like, let her new boyfriend that she's so excited about secretly be like a supervillain or something. Something that would not just make it feel like an add-on or like padding or filler or like a time killer. It's like, once again, the main storyline of the show, or at least like the main storylines, are so fucking good. Why would you want to burden this show with like basically scenes that act like an anchor, kind of weighing it down? But to be fair, like the character of Amber in the early seasons, I was just like, oh my God, like, somebody kill her. Everybody in the show gets killed except for her for some reason. Luckily, I think they got the message when it came to the feedback on the show, and they finally kind of wrote her out of the show entirely, or at least she hasn't appeared in season 4 yet. But on the whole, the show more or less has a giant cast of great characters, and most of the storylines are pretty fucking engaging. But back to the things that work about the show. I love how we're being treated to this big, giant, epic superhero saga that has a very clear destination in mind and is moving toward it in a very determined fashion. I think a lot of superhero franchises these days in film and television suffer from the fact that they don't know where they're going, and they're kind of like doing a season of television, waiting to see if they get renewed, doing another season, but they're always going for short-term goals. But Robert Kirkman, as this show's creator, he knows precisely where the story's going to end, because he already got there many years ago. And having a really strong roadmap is so key for creating a really satisfying epic feeling or epic flavor for a show. Like right now, I've been watching Babylon 5, which is a sci-fi show from the 90s. And JMS, the creator of that show, J. Michael Straczynski, he had seen on too many other shows how they wasted time and money not knowing where they were going. And so he had basically like a 5-season arc kind of mapped out in his head, and it makes the show so much more compelling. It just feels like there's an architecture to the story that makes sense, where you feel like you're in good hands. And I absolutely feel like I'm in good hands with the show. Even if there are the occasional changes or characters or story beats where I'm like, that didn't quite work. If you're patient and you wait 5 seconds, you're going to get yet another story beat that is incredibly satisfying. So I think the show is absolutely worth sticking with if you can suffer through those early seasons where, once again, I feel like they were just they were trying to figure out, do they need to change the original story or not for modern audience sensibilities and that sort of thing. And I feel like over time, the show is kind of reverting to the mean and sticking to the things that really worked on the page. But as far as this big, epic, sprawling saga is concerned, you basically get every single kind of scenario that you would want to see in a superhero story, all contained in one franchise, where whether it's standalone heroes or teams or sci-fi adventures in space, the show does a brilliant job of kind of stirring it all together in satisfying fashion, as opposed to trying to tell the story across multiple shows and movies. I feel like sometimes a lot of these franchises as well get into real trouble trying to tell this big, giant epic, but they're doing so with multiple storytellers across multiple shows and movies, some of which work better than others. Sometimes it's better just to contain it all in one standalone story with one standalone creator and just blast your way forward. But as complimentary as I might be about this overall construction, I do have to complain a little bit about the animation, because I feel like the animation, it's so good in some scenes. You can tell they're basically like saving up money for big action beats or big action scenes, but also trying to stretch their money during a lot of the dramatic scenes. But there are times where the animation just feels so clunky and so ugly and so rudimentary. It's like, just give me a still image and dialogue as opposed to seeing this piss poor animation unfold. That said, the flip side is that when the show really cuts loose, they really go for broke. I mean, once again, the action scenes in the show are totally thrilling, and you're really getting to see, because it's animation, epic, large-scale combat between like heroes that can quite literally move planets versus vast armies and that sort of thing. And yeah, it's just it's the full package. If you are a fan, if you're an unabashed, unapologetic fan of the superhero genre, as we've kind of known it and understood it since the late 30s up through now, especially if you're really into the comics as opposed to kind of mainstream shows and movies, Invincible really gets at the heart of what is the superhero genre. What are these superhero stories all about? Because there's so many shows and movies these days featuring superhero characters where they've fallen into this trap where instead of making mainstream shows and movies feel more like comics, they're trying to make these comics feel more like mainstream shows and movies. Case in point would be the new show, Lanterns. Admittedly, we've only seen the trailer, but that show should be called either Green Lantern or the Green Lantern Corps. Don't call it Lanterns. Don't mute all the colors. You can tell they're running from the name of the character. They're running from the concept. It's like, well, if you're running from the name of the character and you're running from the concept overall, maybe you shouldn't be making a show about Green Lantern. I want somebody who's as big a comic book nerd as Robert Kirkman writing and directing a show like Lanterns and make it feel like Green Lantern. Because Green Lantern, there's nothing kind of mainstream about it. It is some super hardcore nerdy shit about space cops with rings that can do just about anything, and you got to lean into it and wrap your arms around it. And that's one thing I love about Invincible. It knows precisely the show that it wants to be, and it just goes for it. And sometimes it comes up short, but for the most part, it gets it right. So before I get to my spoiler section, let me ask one question. Is 2026 a turning point where we're seeing a return to adaptations as opposed to ruining great books and great comics and so on and so forth? Because so far this year we've had A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which is a pretty goddamn good adaptation of The Hedge Knight, the first novella in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which is right down there. We've had Project Hail Mary, an excellent adaptation of a really good science fiction novel. Now we've got Invincible, which is an excellent adaptation of issues 66 to 78 from Robert Kirkman's Invincible. And later this year, fingers crossed, hopefully be really good, we've got Dune Messiah. Well, actually, I'm calling the movie Dune Messiah. We've got Dune Part 3, which is an adaptation of Dune Messiah. So hopefully, when this year draws to a close, people will be able to look at certain shows and certain movies and say, when you stick to something that already works on the page great and has existing fans, maybe if we just lean into that, these shows and movies will ultimately end up being more satisfying. You don't need to reinvent them. You don't need to change them. Just trust their popularity, trust their fan base. And if you can't trust the popularity of the source material that you're adapting, maybe once again, you're not the right person to be adapting that book or that comic or continuing that movie franchise. So I'm rooting for the rest of the season to deliver. And from what I read last night, kind of revisit, once again, I hadn't read these stories like in 15 years. I'd forgotten a lot of it. If they get to like the best story beats in the war to come, holy shit, this season's going to be quite a ride.
If I'd actually killed Angstrom the first time, so many people would still be alive. I'll do anything to stop that from happening again.
It's not who you are, Mark.
All right, but with all that out of the way, now it's time for the spoiler section. Let's talk about the 3 episodes that we got this morning and the comics that they're based on. And if you're still with me, you don't care about spoilers, or you've already read the comics and you're eager to discuss some of the details. But in an era where I'm constantly kind of like holding my breath and clenching my fists and like in a defensive posture, wondering how a particular concept or story or character is going to be ruined by a lot of contemporary writers and directors in film and television, it's just a relief to watch a show where I'm like, oh, that detail's right from the comic. Oh, that detail's right from the comic. I'm in good hands. I can just sit back and just be a fan and enjoy the ride. And right from the word go, this season, it rearranges the story order a little bit because episode 2 is basically issues 66 and 67 kind of mushed together. But I think this season very wisely chose to open up with a story about Invincible himself, where we basically get a condensed version of all the events from issues 68, 69, and 70, where we see how Mark, he's starting to get a little bit more aggressive. And I like how this season opens up the debate of, should a superhero kill, and when should they kill, and what are the ethical kind of ramifications if you do decide to kill? Because people have been saying for decades, how come Batman doesn't just break Joker's neck and prevent him from murdering, hundreds if not thousands of people in the future. And people started asking those questions in the 80s, like with Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, where some people hypothesized that Batman actually did break Joker's neck at the end, or a comic like Kingdom Come by Mark Waid, where somebody finally did kill the Joker and wondered why the Batman hadn't always done it. But obviously here, there's like, I guess, an additional wrinkle to it, because if Mark decides to start surrendering to this impulse of killing supervillains, all of whom seem to keep coming back stronger than they were before, killing thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, how come he doesn't just kill all of them? Because these are murderous sociopaths, etc. But if he surrenders to that side of his personality, he will become more like a Viltrumite. He'll become more like his father, and obviously his father is starting to modify his ways a little bit, but the big danger is, will Mark become just as bad as some of the alternate versions of himself that we saw in Season 3? And he's trying to resist that. On the other hand, he does want to save lives. And I think this show is doing an excellent job so far of exploring that. Like, to what degree should you be willing to snap somebody's neck? As we see when he's fighting Dinosaurus, like we saw in issue 68, where the person who is Dinosaurus is not in control of his abilities. And when he turns back into a human, he's like, sorry, I don't know what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And Mark's like, all right, should I break his neck right now? And the only thing that stops him from doing so is the arrival of the Guardians. And I was like, all right, not only was that a good scene, but it's ripped straight from the pages, so I'm a very happy boy watching this show.
But trauma like that breaks people.
And the same issue comes up again where he's fighting all those disgusting Sequids, because obviously the Sequids are more or less harmless when they're by themselves, but once they have a host and they start to gain in power, well then, like, basically if the Sequid were to get totally set loose on the planet Earth, it could probably take over the entire planet in a matter of hours, if not days. And so when Mark decides to dispense a little justice, maybe he's doing the wrong thing. Maybe he should not take the law into his own hands. Maybe he should not take a human life who's totally innocent and just happened to be possessed. On the other hand, think about how many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives were saved as a result of him making that decision. But once again, is he becoming, slowly but surely, more like a proper Viltrumite? Because as we learn in episode 2, humans and Viltrumites are basically like 99% compatible, which is why Mark is almost as strong as his father at this point, because human beings are uniquely equipped in becoming like Viltrumites if they get a little bit of that DNA. And what's interesting is seeing Walton Goggins as Cecil, or Cecil, I always get the pronunciation of his name off, but seeing how he's basically telling Mark, let me make this calls. Like, I already don't sleep. I already look 1,000, even though I'm not 1,000. Like, I've already decided to burden myself with all these horrible decisions. Let me be the one who makes those hard decisions so that the rest of you can sleep at night. And I think if there's a consistent, best ingredient or best performance to the show, it would be Walton Goggins. He's just been an absolute. I think he's better in the show than he is in the comic, and that is saying something. But yeah, he's really, both he and J.K. Simmons have just done an absolutely brilliant job with their work on the show. But there are other times where the show is so faithful to the comic, it almost begs the question, why even make the show at all if you're just going to do like beat for beat recreations, like when we see Conquest waking up and he realizes, oh my God, those idiots, they let me live, and just buck-ass nude, he just flies straight out. I love the character of Conquest. He's an absolutely fantastic character. But I guess the reality is there are a lot of people out there where no matter how much you might poke them and prod them, like, with a stick, they're never going to read ever. And so there's some people who will never read a comic ever. And so maybe that's why you have to make the show. But also another thing, when you're adapting a big, giant, sprawling saga with a lot of key storylines and a lot of characters, as George Martin has pointed out on some of the shows adapting his books, little teeny tiny changes seem like nothing in a standalone scenario, but they create a butterfly effect. Because if you no scene or beat is totally divorced from or independent from the rest of the narrative. If you make a change, it sends out ripples across the entire story, and those changes that are made early on in a show have massive ripples later on. It's very hard to kind of reset and get back on track. So maybe Robert Kirkman very wisely realizes, you know what? I got to stick to the main key story beats like Conquest escaping, because if he doesn't escape in that fashion, well then what's supposed to come a few episodes from now will be tougher to set up. And so he's just following the roadmap. But in any case, as somebody who thought it was hilarious that Conquest is just flying around buck-ass nude, we got treated to that in the animated show as well. And it made me chuckle. But let's talk about episode 2, which more or less tackles the events of issues 66 and 67 from the comics in very satisfying fashion, except for Seth Rogen. And I know a lot of people love Seth Rogen. I know a lot of people love his TV show about the studio and that sort of thing. I think if there's one actor who is almost as overexposed as Pedro Pascal, it is Seth Rogen, where if I hear his voice, I'm like, I kind of flinch involuntarily. And I loved a lot of his comedies back in the early days. But my biggest problem now when I hear his voice, whether he's in live action, like making a brief appearance in a show like The Boys, or doing a lot of voice work in a show like this, he never stops acting and talking like Seth Rogen. I feel like if you're going to talk about like real deal actors like Walton Goggins or J.K. Simmons or any of the some of the other actors that are in this show, they are real artists. They are experts at their craft, and they really imbue their characters with all sorts of soul and personality and dimensions where the actor disappears and they just become the character. With Seth Rogen, I always feel like he shows up at the recording studio with a cup of coffee in his hand. All right, we got 10 minutes to record this. What do you got for me? He just kind of rips through the lines. They just kind of vomit them out. And so I just feel like I know he's one of the producers on this show, but it's just a huge disservice to the character of Alan the Alien having Seth Rogen kind of phoning it in, especially when J.K. Simmons is doing such a great job. But if you set aside my dislike of Seth Rogen and his style or his approach to acting, this was a really, really good episode where we learn about the Scourge virus, where basically the entire Viltrumite empire was reduced from millions down to about 50 pure-blooded Viltrumites, who now, in addition to trying to maintain the illusion of being this empire, expanding the universe, they need to start reproducing. And one of the reasons that Omni-Man was on Earth was not only to control Earth, but to see if human beings are compatible with Viltrumite DNA. And the fact that Invincible is as strong as he is. Yes, clearly, if they just wanted to send the remaining Viltrumites to Earth and just start breeding rapidly, they could probably get their numbers back up pretty quickly. But when it came to showing the consequences of the Scourge virus, let's just say that this is not animation for teeny tiny kids. Or if teeny tiny kids are watching this, they better be very broad-minded and very mature in their taste, because I imagine a lot of them would have nightmares forever watching all these Viltrumites vomiting up blood and bleeding from their eyes as their whole civilization collapses into ruin. And I think the animation style of the show does look kid-friendly, even if the material is very much 18 plus. I mean, I don't know what age I would have liked watching this show when I was a kid. I was watching Conan the Barbarian when I was 5, so I was progressing very quickly. But I imagine there are a lot of parents who are like, oh, animation, superheroes. Let me put my toddler down in front of the TV, and I'm sure when they get to episode 2 of season 4, those kids are like, Mommy! It's pretty hardcore. Speaking of 18 plus content, there's a lot of sex in this episode as well, as Alan the Alien makes up for lost time with his girlfriend. And from the comics, there were like multiple pages and multiple panels where Omni-Man was covering up his ears with pillows because he was just listening to this, like a lot of huffing and puffing coming from these aliens in the next room. And I mean, it was almost like they just took the panel and just like spit it right into the computer and then brought it to life. I mean, it was that faithful in terms of the execution. So just overall, I think Alan the Alien and Omni-Man have turned into kind of like a really cool kind of team within the overall structure of this show, and I like watching them work together, especially the fact that Omni-Man is still a little bit loyal to the Viltrumites. Like when he realizes who caused the Scourge and who set it loose, he very nearly reverts to his old ways. And so, yeah, so far, so good. Episode 2 of Season 4 was fucking fantastic. Also, this episode gave us a few scenes poking fun at the crew from Star Trek The Next Generation. And while that might have been kind of funny on the page back around like 2010, 2011, at this point in 2026, Star Trek has already become self-parody through shows like Star Trek Starfleet Academy. And so maybe those jokes from the comics from 15 years ago don't land with quite as much intensity because people don't realize at one time Star Trek was actually something cool, whereas now it's just a public embarrassment where fans like to ridicule it at every available opportunity. In episode 3 of season 4, that was pretty good. We get some good scenes where Oliver and Titan team up trying to take down Mr. Liu. And Mr. Liu, I just love the fact that his power is, while he doesn't necessarily become a great dragon, a big dragon comes out of him. But it's not like just like your average dragon. It's like a dragon as big as a goddamn city. But I feel like that's a pretty cool power. He's overpowered, but also very vulnerable if you can find where his actual body is located. But the big thrill in episode 3 of season 4 was yet another invasion by the Flaxans. And because the Flaxans in their home dimension, time progresses much more quickly, they have a lot more time to prepare and like basically try and like that each invasion gets more dangerous than the last. And the big question is, at what point do we just do we lose the ability to repel them because they have so much more time on their side to prepare? Also, why are the Flaxans so obsessed with taking Earth? But we get a good cliffhanger where Monster Girl and Robot are trapped on the other side because they were going to try and lead the Guardians and basically like eliminating the Flaxen threat once and for all. And we thought Omni-Man had done that. I can't remember what season it was, but basically Omni-Man got trapped over there and spent months just like, reducing that world to ashes. But once again, they've had a lot of time to rebuild. So very satisfying episode, but once again, brings up the subject again. At what point do you need to kill your enemy before if you know that eventually they're going to rise in power and they're going to rebuild and they're going to come back stronger than ever. And there will come a day where they are unable to repel the Flaxens or any of the other villains in this show. And also, I love this show's willingness to reveal villains as just being heartless and cruel and bloodthirsty and savage and twisted. For a show that appears kid-friendly, it's constantly reminding us it's definitely geared toward a much more aggressive sensibility, and I applaud them for it. But in closing, I do want to talk a little bit about animation geared towards an adult sensibility, whether that's from Japan or domestic or Eastern Europe. I mean, all around the world, there's been an incredible tradition over the last 100 years of making animation geared toward an adult sensibility. And I keep flirting with making some videos, but the reality is the topic is so big and there's so much incredible stuff out there. It needs to be multiple videos. Like, you can't just do a top 10 list of the best animated movies geared toward adults because you would just be leaving so many on the side. Like, you basically need to narrow the focus to top 10 anime from the 1980s that your parents don't want you to see. And yes, I'm a snob. I pronounce it anime. A lot of people today say anime, and for me, anime sounds like something that goes on a sandwich. And I know that people from Japan make fun of us for saying anime. So I say anime, even if other people think I'm being a douche if I do. But speaking of anime, Prison School is one that I'm going to recommend, which I discovered recently. I'd seen a lot of people talking about it, and if you're looking for something very contemporary that's got like so much like fantastic humor, but also wild violence and that sort of thing. Like, the premise is very simple. A bunch of boys, or several boys who are at an all-girls school, get in trouble, and they basically get imprisoned, and the girls are responsible for their discipline and their punishments and that sort of thing. I mean, I laughed myself to pieces watching it. It's so fucking good and well worth adding to a physical media library. Oftentimes I'll buy the Blu-ray because I'm afraid it'll be censored on Crunchyroll. Crunchyroll will show animated movies or animated shows as they were broadcast on TV in Japan, but that's not always the most uncensored version of it. But since I'm wearing a Fritz the Cat shirt, let's talk about animator Ralph Bakshi. If your taste in animation is more Western than Eastern, I'm going to recommend that you watch the entire career of Ralph Bakshi because you'll like some of them more than others. But in the 1970s, he was the king of Western animation between Fritz the Cat, Heavy Traffic, Coonskin. I've got the Blu-ray back in my back room as well. Coonskin, if you like blaxploitation films, Coonskin's got to be high on your list of movies to watch. He made Wizards, one of the best original sci-fi kind of fantasy adventure movies ever. He did The Lord of the Rings, which was the first book and a half that Tolkien wrote. And then in the 80s, he made some incredible stuff like American Pop and Fire and Ice. But yeah, for people who like animation for adults, the career of Ralph Bakshi is well worth studying in great detail. But if your taste in animation always has your eyes looking to the Far East, to Japan, the good news is there are enough great shows and movies cranked out by Japan to keep you busy for a very, very long time without having to go back for like second helpings of something that you already love. But if you really want to see something rough, like the really dark stuff, I mean, everybody knows about Orotsukudoji, the Legend of the Overfiend, because they basically invented the hentai category. And you watch it these days, like if you can find the uncensored version of it, you're just like, oh my goodness. I mean, it's bonkers. But one that I saw for the first time last year in preparation for a video that I still want to make one day for controversial Japanese animation, episode 2 of the show Violence Jack. I think I'm still recovering from just how depraved that was. But if your taste is more artistic and more old school, Belladonna of Sadness, it pulls no punches, but it's a much more kind of respectable animated movie, even if it has really, really dark subject matter. Golgo 13, The Professional from the early 80s, I still think might be the most entertaining movie ever made. I mean, there are a lot of movies that are competing for that title, but Golgo the 13, The Professional delights me every single time. Of course, Ninja Scroll is fucking incredible. I go back to that one a lot. Basically, any movie by Yoshiaki Kawajiri from like the 80s through the early 2000s, he was just untouchable. But the real Motherlode, perhaps the darkest animated movie that I've ever seen, one that was, for me, the most disturbing, is one that's kind of hard to find, but you can find it on the Internet Archive. It's about 45 minutes long, and it was made for almost no money. It's called Midori, and it's pure poetry, But that's only if you combine pure poetry with the most depraved, savage nightmare that you could possibly imagine. And the animator spent years and years and years just hand illustrating it. It took him forever to do it. And it's once again, it's very low budget, very rudimentary, but it's got an undeniable power to completely shake you to the core of your soul. So to be continued. I love the subject of animation for adults, and I need to make more videos on that front. But there's just so many good contenders to discuss. I just need to find a way to break up the topic into bite-sized chunks so that it can be more manageable. Otherwise, it'll just get too overwhelming. In any case, back to Invincible. At a time where the superhero genre or category or superhero shows and movies appear to be in a rapid state of decline, and as we saw last year, like the one big movie from DC and the three big movies from Marvel, they all seriously underperformed compared to how they might have performed back in the 20-teens. And obviously in the 20-teens, we probably got too many, but we also got spoiled. We got a lot of good superhero shows and movies back in the 20-teens, and so it's inevitable that there would be a bit of a pullback. But I think the 2020s have been pretty lousy as far as superhero content is concerned. But one of the few remaining good ones is Invincible. If you really love superheroes, like what they represent at their core, everything that's great about superhero stories, Invincible might be kind of like the last remaining island where you can just completely surrender over to what made them great on the page and what makes them great on the screen. And who knows, maybe if the show gets a little bit more popular, I would love it if they wrap up the animated series with like a movie or two, as opposed to just constantly doing shows. Like the same way Demon Slayer started out as a show in animation, and now they're doing 3 movies to bring the entire epic to a satisfying conclusion. But we'll just have to wait and see what kind of numbers the show generates over the rest of the season. But I'll definitely be watching it, and I recommend that if you're a fan of Invincible, that you watch it as well. But with that, it's time to wrap this sucker up. Hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell, becoming a member, all that good stuff. And I'll be back at you tomorrow with my review for Ready or Not 2, Here I Come. But thanks again for watching, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.